There are places in Louisiana where the earth itself remembers, where the soil holds secrets deeper than any grave, and the water whispers things that should have been forgotten long ago. In the year of our Lord 1888, there existed such a place, though you will find no mention of it in any official record, no mark upon any map that honest cartographers would dare to draw. The parish had no name that anyone living would speak aloud, and the few who knew of it would cross themselves and look away when asked. This is the story of Bethel Hollow Church and the bells that would not stop ringing. This is the story of what rose from beneath and what was always waiting there. The summer of 1888 came to southern Louisiana like a fever, thick and suffocating, the kind of heat that made men's minds wander into dark places. The war had been over for more than 2 decades, but the South still wore its wounds like a shroud, and nowhere was this more evident than in the backwater parishes where the cypress trees grew so thick that sunlight became a rare and precious thing. These were the forgotten places, the lands that even Reconstruction had passed by, where the old ways still held sway, and the boundary between the living world and whatever lay beyond it had always been thin as paper, worn translucent by time and suffering. Bethel Hollow sat at the edge of a great swamp, a community of perhaps 60 souls, mostly former slaves who had nowhere else to go when freedom came, and a handful of white families too poor or too stubborn to leave the land their grandfathers had bled into. The town, if you could call it that, consisted of a general store that doubled as a post office, a handful of weathered houses built on stilts to keep them above the seasonal floods, and the church. Always the church. It stood at the very center of the settlement, a white clapboard structure with a bell tower that rose above the surrounding trees like an accusing finger pointed at heaven. The church had been built in 1852. A preacher named Josiah Crane, a man whose fervor for salvation was matched only by his capacity for cruelty. He had come to this nameless stretch of swampland with a vision, he said, given to him by God himself in a dream of fire and blood. He would build a church, he declared, that would stand as a beacon of righteousness in this godless wilderness, a place where sinners would come to be cleansed of their wickedness or be destroyed in the attempt. The locals, both black and white, had helped to build it, not out of devotion, but out of fear, for Josiah Crane had a way of making people believe that their immortal souls hung in the balance of his approval. The church was built of cypress wood hauled from the deepest part of the swamp, wood so dark it was almost black. Wood that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. The foundation was laid upon ground that the old folks said should never have been disturbed, a place where the Chitimacha had once performed rituals that the Spanish missionaries had tried and failed to stamp out centuries before. But Josiah Crane paid no mind to such superstitions. He drove the first stake into the soft earth with his own hands, declaring that any ground could be made holy if enough righteous blood was spilled upon it. The bells came later, 3 of them, cast in bronze in a foundry in New Orleans and brought up river by steamboat, then hauled through miles of swamp on the backs of men who waded through water up to their chests, through stands of cypress hung with Spanish moss that looked like the hair of drowned women. The largest bell weighed 300 pounds and bore an inscription in Latin that none of the locals could read. The 2 smaller bells flanked it in the tower, and when they rang together, their sound carried for miles across the flat wetlands, a sound that seemed to penetrate not just the air but the very substance of the world itself. Josiah Crane died in 1863, found one morning in the church with his throat torn open as if by some great animal, though no animal tracks were ever found, and the church doors had been locked from the inside. The war was raging then, and there was no proper investigation. They buried him in the churchyard, in an unmarked grave, and the church stood empty for nearly a year before another preacher could be found willing to take up the pulpit. That preacher was Ezekiel Ward, and it is his journal that survives, hidden for more than a century in the archives of the Louisiana State Museum, filed under a catalog number that no one had accessed until a graduate student researching post-Reconstruction religious movements stumbled upon it in 1973. The journal itself is a slim volume, bound in water-stained leather, its pages brittle and spotted with mold. But the words are still legible, written in a careful hand that grows increasingly frantic as the entries progress. Ezekiel Ward arrived in Bethel Hollow in the spring of 1864 with his wife Martha and their young daughter Sarah, who was 7 years old and had never known any home except the itinerant life of a circuit preacher's family. They came by boat, poling through the winding waterways that threaded through the swamp like the veins of some great sleeping beast. Martha Ward wrote letters to her sister in Baton Rouge, letters that were discovered years later, and in them she described her first sight of Bethel Hollow with an almost palpable sense of dread. The settlement, she wrote, seemed to crouch beneath the weight of the surrounding wilderness, as if it were being slowly swallowed by the very land it had been carved from. The houses were dark and silent, their windows like empty eye sockets. The people moved slowly, as if walking through water, and they spoke in whispers, even in broad daylight. And the church, she wrote, the church seemed wrong somehow, though she could not say exactly why. It was not the architecture, which was plain and functional, nor the condition of the building, which was well maintained despite the years of war and neglect. It was something else, something in the way it sat upon the land, as if it did not quite belong there, as if it had been forced into place against the will of the earth itself. Ezekiel Ward was a different sort of man than Josiah Crane had been. He was gentle and soft-spoken, a scholar who had studied at a seminary in Kentucky. Before the war disrupted his plans for a comfortable parish in a civilized town, the war had left him scarred in ways that had nothing to do with physical wounds. He had served as a chaplain for a Louisiana regiment, had seen things in the mud and blood of battle that had shaken his faith to its foundations. He came to Bethel Hollow seeking redemption, believing that in ministering to this forgotten community he might find his way back to the God he had lost somewhere between Shiloh and Vicksburg. His first sermon was delivered on a Sunday in April, with most of the community in attendance. He spoke of forgiveness and healing, of the need to lay down the burdens of the past and look toward a future where black and white might live as equals under the sight of God. It was a radical message for that time and place, and it was met with stony silence from the white families and cautious hope from the black. But he meant it, every word, and over the weeks and months that followed, he worked to make it real. He baptized children in the slow-moving creek that fed into the swamp. He married young couples who had been living together without benefit of ceremony, because there had been no one to perform the rites. He sat with the dying and spoke words of comfort, and he buried the dead in the churchyard with prayers that he hoped would speed them to whatever peace awaited on the other side. And every Sunday, he climbed the narrow stairs to the bell tower and rang the bells himself, calling the faithful to worship, the three bronze voices singing out across the swamp in tones that were somehow both beautiful and unsettling. It was Martha who first noticed that something was wrong with the bells. She mentioned it to Ezekiel one evening as they sat on the porch of the small house that served as the parsonage, watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk. The bells, she said, had sounded different that morning. Not wrong exactly, but different. There was a quality to their tone that had not been there before, something that made her think of sorrow, of a grief so deep and old that it had no bottom. Ezekiel had laughed gently and told her it was only her imagination, that bronze bells did not change their sound once they were cast and hung. But privately, in the pages of his journal, he admitted that he too had noticed something strange. The bells seemed heavier somehow when he pulled the ropes. They resisted, just slightly, as if something were holding them back, and when they did ring, the sound lingered longer than it should, echoing across the water long after the physics of sound should have allowed it to die away. The first real sign that something was deeply amiss came in late June, when the rains began. Louisiana summers are always wet, but that year the rain came with an intensity that the old-timers said they had never seen before. It fell in sheets, turning the paths between the houses into rivers of red mud, making the swamp rise until it lapped at the foundations of the buildings. The church, standing as it did on the lowest ground in the settlement, began to take on water. The floorboards grew damp and then wet, and a smell rose from beneath them, a smell of rot and old earth and something else, something that made people gag and cover their noses when they entered for services. Ezekiel tried to combat it. He and several of the men from the congregation spent days digging drainage ditches around the church, trying to divert the water away from the foundation. But it was no use. The water kept coming, seeping up through cracks in the floor, pooling in the corners, leaving dark stains on the walls. And with the water came other things. The first was the sounds. At night, when the rain drummed on the roof and the wind howled through the cypress trees, people lying awake in their beds would hear noises coming from the direction of the church, scratching sounds as if something were clawing at the wood from below. whispers and voices that spoke no language anyone recognized. And sometimes, when the wind died down for a moment, they would hear singing, faint and far away, a hymn in a minor key that none of them knew. Then there were the dreams. Almost everyone in the settlement began to have them, the same dream repeating night after night. They dreamed they were standing in the church, but the church was filling with water, rising from below, black water that stank of decay. They could see shapes moving in the water, pale forms that might have been bodies or might have been something else. And through it all, the bells were ringing, 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 a sound that went on until they woke, gasping in the darkness, their hearts hammering in their chests. Ezekiel Ward documented all of this in his journal, his handwriting growing more cramped and difficult to read as the weeks passed. He tried to find rational explanations. The sounds were just the building settling, he wrote. The dreams were the product of anxiety and the oppressive weather. The smell was merely stagnant water and mildew. But even as he wrote these things, he knew he was lying to himself. The truth was that the church was sinking. Not quickly, not all at once, but slowly, inexorably, as if the earth beneath it were opening up to swallow it whole. The front steps, which had once been at ground level, now sat in a pool of standing water. The foundation had developed cracks, wide enough to put a hand through, and the building itself had begun to tilt, just slightly, enough that the altar at the front of the sanctuary was no longer level. The congregation dwindled. Families began to make excuses for not attending services. Some left Bethel Hollow entirely, packing what they could carry and disappearing into the swamp, headed for relatives in other parishes or just away, anywhere that was not here. Those who remained were the ones who had nowhere else to go, the poorest and most desperate, and they came to church on Sundays because habit and fear of damnation were stronger than their fear of whatever was happening to the building. It was in mid-July that things took a darker turn. A young man named Tobias, one of the former slaves who had stayed in the area after emancipation, was found dead in the churchyard one morning. His body was lying face down in the mud, his hands clawed into the earth as if he had been trying to dig himself into the ground. There was no mark upon him, no sign of violence, but his face, when they turned him over, was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth open in a silent scream. The local constable, such as he was, ruled it a death from natural causes, perhaps a fit of some kind brought on by the heat. But everyone who saw the body knew better. Whatever had killed Tobias, it had scared him to death, literally frightened the life out of him. And the worst part was where he had been found. He was lying directly over one of the unmarked graves in the churchyard, a grave that local tradition said was that of Josiah Crane himself. After that, people stopped coming to church altogether, except for Ezekiel and his family. He continued to hold services every Sunday, standing in the pulpit and preaching to empty pews while water dripped from the ceiling and the building groaned and settled around him. Martha begged him to leave, to take Sarah and find another parish, somewhere safe and dry where the ground stayed solid underfoot. But he refused. This was his calling, he said. God had sent him here for a reason, and he would not abandon his post no matter what trials were set before him. In his journal, though, his true thoughts were darker. He had begun to suspect that there was something under the church, something that had been there long before Josiah Crane ever drove the first stake into the ground. The Chitimacha had known about it, he believed. That was why they had performed their rituals in this place, not to summon something but to keep it contained, to prevent it from rising. And Josiah Crane, in his arrogance and zealous fervor, had broken those protections when he built his church, had torn open a barrier that should never have been disturbed. But what was it? Ezekiel had no answer. He pored over what few books he had, looking for any mention of similar phenomena. He wrote letters to colleagues in Baton Rouge and New Orleans, asking obliquely about local folklore and native legends. Most went unanswered. Those that did reply offered nothing but platitudes and suggestions that he was suffering from nervous exhaustion brought on by the climate and isolation. The bells, meanwhile, had taken on a life of their own. No one had rung them since early July, when Ezekiel had given up calling the congregation that no longer came. But they rang anyway. Not every day, but often enough that it became a source of constant dread. They would ring in the middle of the night, 3 clear peals that would wake everyone for miles around. They would ring during thunderstorms, their sound cutting through the rumble of thunder like the cry of some anguished spirit. And sometimes, They would ring on clear, still days, when there was no wind and no earthly reason for the bells to move at all. Ezekiel climbed the tower to investigate. The ropes hung straight and still, undisturbed. The bells themselves were immobile, their bronze surfaces covered in a patina of green corrosion that seemed to have appeared overnight. But even as he stood there, watching, one of the smaller bells began to move, swinging slowly back and forth with no hand upon the rope, ringing out a single mournful note that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath the earth rather than from the bell itself. He fled the tower, half falling down the narrow stairs in his haste to get away. When he reached the bottom, he found Martha waiting for him, her face pale and drawn. She had heard it too, she said. Everyone had heard it. And worse, she had seen something through the window of the parsonage, something moving in the swamp near the church. A figure that walked upright but seemed wrong in ways she could not articulate. Its movements too fluid, too boneless, like a person made of mud and moss and decay. That night, Ezekiel Ward made a decision. He would perform an exorcism. He had read about such things, though he had never believed he would need to attempt one. The Episcopal Church did not officially recognize such practices, but Ezekiel was desperate, and desperation has a way of making believers out of skeptics. He prepared himself, fasting for a day, praying until his knees were raw from kneeling on the wooden floor of the parsonage. He put on his vestments and gathered the items he would need. Holy water that he had blessed himself, a Bible, a crucifix of plain wood. Martha pleaded with him not to go, but he was resolute. He kissed her and Sarah goodbye, as if he were going off to war, and walked through the rain to the church. It was near midnight when he arrived, and the building loomed before him like a beast crouched in the darkness, water lapping at its walls, the bell tower rising into the stormy sky like a broken fang. He entered through the front door, which stood ajar, though he was certain he had locked it. The interior was in worse condition than he remembered. The water was now ankle-deep across the entire floor. The pews had been pushed out of alignment, as if by some great force from below. The walls were covered in a black mold that glistened wetly in the light of his lantern. And the smell, dear God, the smell was overwhelming. A stench of putrefaction and ancient earth and something else. Something that his mind refused to process. Something that existed outside the realm of normal human experience. He waded to the front of the church, to the altar that now tilted at a sharp angle. He set his lantern down and opened his Bible, his hands shaking so badly that he could barely hold the book. He began to read, his voice echoing in the empty space. He read passages about casting out demons and cleansing unclean places. He read prayers of protection and invocations of divine power. And as he read, the water began to rise. It came up through the floorboards in jets and spurts, as if forced by some great pressure from below. The building shuddered and groaned, timbers cracking with sounds like rifle shots. And then the bells began to ring, all three of them together. A cacophony of sound that was deafening in the enclosed space, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his bones and teeth. Ezekiel kept reading, shouting now to be heard over the bells. He splashed holy water toward the corners of the room, toward the floor, toward the altar. He held the crucifix up like a weapon, as if he could physically drive back whatever presence was manifesting in this place. And for a moment, just a moment, the bells stopped. The water ceased its rise. There was silence, absolute and complete. A silence so profound that it seemed to have weight and substance. Then the floor beneath him gave way. Not collapsed exactly. It was more as if it melted, the wood turning soft and rotten in an instant, dissolving into black mud that sucked at his legs, pulling him down. He grabbed for the edge of the hole that had opened, but his hands found no purchase on the slick, crumbling wood. He dropped his Bible and his crucifix, his lantern falling into the darkness below and winking out, leaving him in blackness broken only by the intermittent flashes of lightning through the windows. He was sinking into the earth itself, being drawn down into something that should not exist, a space beneath the church that went down and down and down, far deeper than any natural cavity should go. He could feel things moving around him in the mud and water, things that brushed against his legs and arms, things that might have been roots or might have been fingers. He tried to scream, but mud filled his mouth, thick and foul, and then he heard the singing. It was coming from below him, from the depths into which he was being pulled. Voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, singing in harmony, a hymn he did not recognize in words he did not know, but he understood its meaning nonetheless, understood it in the way that prey understands the intent of the predator. It was a song of hunger, of ancient and terrible need, of something that had been waiting in the darkness beneath the earth for longer than human civilization, waiting for foolish men to build their churches and ring their bells and offer up their faith like a feast for things that existed in the spaces between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond. He fought, though it was useless. He clawed at the mud, tried to swim upward through the thick morass. But the singing grew louder, the voices more insistent, and he felt himself being pulled deeper, his struggles growing weaker as exhaustion and terror overwhelmed him. His lungs burned. His vision, already compromised by the darkness, began to narrow to a pinpoint. He thought of Martha and Sarah, and the thought broke his heart more than any physical agony ever could. The last thing he remembered before unconsciousness took him was the sensation of breaking through into open space, of falling through the mud into a vast cavity beneath the earth, and in the instant before he blacked out, by the ghostly phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from the walls of that impossible chamber, he saw them, the singers, row upon row of figures standing in water that came up to their waists, their mouths open, their eyes empty sockets, their bodies in various states of decay. Some wore the remnants of Native American clothing, centuries old. Others wore Spanish armor, green with corrosion. Still others wore the rough homespun of enslaved people or the tattered uniforms of Confederate and Union soldiers. And at the front, conducting this choir of the dead with withered arms, stood a figure in black that might once have been a man, but was now something else, something that wore human form the way one might wear a coat. When consciousness returned, Ezekiel found himself lying on the bank of the creek, 100 yards from the church, with no memory of how he had gotten there. It was dawn. The rain had stopped. He was covered in mud and filth, his vestments torn nearly to rags, his body aching as if he had been beaten. He sat up slowly, every movement an agony, and looked toward the church. It was still standing, but it had sunk even further. The water now came halfway up the walls. The door hung from one hinge, and as he watched, unable to look away, the bells began to ring again, slowly, methodically, 3 deep tones that rolled across the swamp like a funeral dirge. He staggered back to the parsonage, where Martha met him at the door, weeping with relief. She had not expected to see him alive. She had heard the bells ringing all through the night, and when they had finally stopped near dawn, she had been certain that meant he was dead. He tried to tell her what had happened, but the words would not come. His mind shied away from the memory like a horse refusing a fence. That day, he made the decision to leave. He could no longer deny what was happening, could no longer pretend that faith and prayer would be enough to combat whatever evil had taken root in this place. They would pack what they could carry and go, leave Bethel Hollow to whatever fate awaited it. Let others, braver or more foolish, deal with the church and its bells. But even that simple plan was thwarted. When they tried to leave, poling their small boat down the waterway that led away from the settlement, they found their way blocked. Trees had fallen across the channel, too many to be natural, too precisely placed to be accidental. They tried other routes, but each was similarly obstructed. It was as if the swamp itself had conspired to keep them trapped. They returned to the parsonage, and that night they barricaded the doors and windows. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the sounds outside, splashing in the water, footsteps on the porch, voices calling their names, voices that sounded almost but not quite like people they had known. And through it all, the bells kept ringing, sometimes softly, sometimes with a frantic urgency, sometimes with a slow, measured cadence that sounded like a heartbeat. Sarah, who had been silent through much of the ordeal, finally spoke. She told them that she had been having dreams too, dreams that were more than dreams. In them, she said, she walked through the church and down into the earth below. She saw the singers in their eternal choir, and she understood what they wanted. They were not evil, she said, not exactly. They were prisoners, souls trapped by rituals gone wrong, by bargains made centuries ago, by the weight of blood and suffering that had soaked into this land. The church had been built on a thin place, a place where the barrier between worlds was weak, and every ring of the bells, every prayer spoken in that sanctified space, had fed the thing that waited below, had given it strength to pull more souls down into its grasp. and now it wanted more. It wanted them. It wanted everyone in Bethel Hollow. It would not stop until it had claimed every living soul in the settlement, adding their voices to the eternal choir, their essences to the feast of the thing beneath. Ezekiel listened to his daughter speak these things in a voice that was too calm, too knowing for a child of 7, and he knew that she was right, knew it with a certainty that bypassed logic and reason and went straight to the primitive core of his being. They were trapped here, and there would be no escape. The only question was how long they could hold out before the inevitable occurred. The journal entries become more fragmented after this point. Days blur together. Ezekiel writes of rationing their food, of drinking rainwater collected in barrels, of the constant sound of the bells that never quite stops even when they seem to be silent, a phantom ringing that echoes in the mind. He writes of attempts to pray, but the words taste like ash in his mouth. He writes of watching through the windows as the few remaining residents of Bethel Hollow are taken, one by one, disappearing into the swamp or the church, their screams cut short with terrible finality. He writes of the night when Martha went to the door, drawn by something he could not see or hear, and only his physical restraint kept her from opening it and walking out into the darkness. She fought him with a strength that should have been impossible, screaming that they were calling her, that she had to go to them, that the singing was beautiful, and if he would only listen, he would understand. He tied her to a chair with rope, hating himself for it, while she wept and begged and eventually fell silent, staring at nothing with eyes that had become as empty as those of the figures he had seen below the church. He writes of Sarah, who stopped speaking altogether, who spent her days staring out the window toward the church, her lips moving soundlessly as if she were singing along with voices only she could hear. He tried to cover her ears, but she would tear away whatever he used, returning always to her vigil at the window, watching and listening to the church that was now more in the swamp than above it. The last coherent entry in Ezekiel Ward's journal is dated August 3, 1888. By that point, the church was almost completely submerged. Only the bell tower remained above water, rising from the dark surface of the swamp like a gravestone marking the burial site of all hope. The bells still rang, though how this was physically possible with the tower filled with water, Ezekiel could not explain and no longer cared to understand. He wrote that he had finally accepted the truth. There would be no rescue, no divine intervention. They were going to die here, all 3 of them, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. His faith, which had sustained him through war and hardship and doubt, had finally broken completely. He understood now what Josiah Crane must have understood in his final moments, why his throat had been torn out by invisible claws. The thing beneath the church did not fear God. It was older than God, or at least older than any conception of God that human minds had invented to comfort themselves in the darkness. It existed in the spaces between faith and despair, feeding on both equally. The final words written in the journal are these: "The bells are ringing. Martha has stopped struggling. Sarah is smiling. I can hear the singing now, so beautiful, so terrible. They are calling us down, down into the dark water, down into the earth. And I think, God forgive me, I think I want to go. I think I have always wanted to go. We are walking to the church now. The water is warm. The singing is so loud, so clear. I understand the words now. They are singing in my voice, in our voices, all of us. Everyone who ever came to this place, everyone who ever heard the bells. We are all singing together. We'll always be singing, forever and ever. World without end. Amen." The journal ends there. In 1890, 2 years after these events, a survey team from the U.S. Geological Survey was mapping the waterways of southern Louisiana for potential drainage and development projects. They made note of an anomaly in one of the unnamed parishes, a settlement that appeared on older maps, but which they could find no trace of. When they attempted to investigate, they found only swamp, dense and impenetrable, with no signs of human habitation. One member of the team, a man named Robert Sterling, wrote in his field notes that they did hear bells ringing as they poled through the area, faint and far away, though there was no structure visible that could account for the sound. He noted it as a probable auditory illusion caused by the wind moving through hollow trees, but added that it had been unnerving nonetheless, and that his party had made camp elsewhere that night, rather than remain in that particular stretch of swamp. Over the decades that followed, there were occasional reports from hunters and fishermen of bells ringing in the deep swamp of southern Louisiana, in an area where no church had ever been recorded. These reports were dismissed as folklore, local color, the kind of ghost story that every region accumulates over time. No serious investigation was ever undertaken. The land was eventually purchased by a timber company, but they found the area too difficult to log profitably, and it was left to the cypress and the water and whatever else made its home there. In 1933, during the Great Depression, a group of squatters attempted to establish a settlement in the area. They built crude shelters on high ground and tried to make a living hunting and trapping. They lasted less than a month. The few who made it back to civilization told wild stories of bells ringing in the night, of voices singing in the darkness, of something in the water that was neither alligator nor any natural creature. They said the swamp wanted them, was trying to pull them down into it, and that they had fled barely ahead of some presence that followed them through the waterways, something that moved beneath the surface, displacing vast amounts of water but never quite surfacing. During World War II, the area was briefly considered as a potential training ground for troops who would be fighting in the Pacific Theater, as the swamp environment was thought to be similar to conditions in the Philippines and New Guinea. A small reconnaissance team was sent to evaluate the site. They reported back that the area was unsuitable for any military purpose and recommended against any further investigation. When pressed for details, the officer in charge would only say that there were unexplained phenomena that he could not adequately explain in an official report, and that in his professional opinion, the area should be left alone. In the 1960s, during the height of the civil rights movement, there was a brief resurgence of interest in the history of post-Civil War African American communities in Louisiana. Researchers attempted to find evidence of Bethel Hollow, working from references in old census records and church documents from nearby parishes. They found nothing but swamp. Carbon dating of wood samples from a few pilings they discovered suggested the remnants of structures from the late 19th century, but nothing conclusive. What they did find, and what troubled them enough that they abandoned the project, was an underwater structure in what appeared to be a sinkhole or natural spring. The water was too deep and too dark to properly explore with the equipment they had available, but they reported what looked like a bell tower, upright and intact, standing in water that their weighted line suggested was at least 100 feet deep. They took photographs, but none developed properly. They all showed only darkness and occasionally a strange luminescence that seemed to come from beneath the water rather than from their flashlights. One team member, a graduate student named Marcus Webb, insisted on diving down to investigate. He was dissuaded by the others, but that night he apparently returned to the site alone. His body was found 3 days later, miles downstream, bloated and torn by what wildlife officials said was consistent with alligator activity. But those who prepared the body for burial noted that his face wore an expression of transcendent peace, and that his lips were parted as if he had died in the middle of singing. The site was marked on their maps and then forgotten, the project abandoned due to lack of funding and the graduation of the students involved. The professor who had organized the expedition died of a heart attack 6 months later. The remaining members of the team went on to other careers, and none of them ever returned to that stretch of Louisiana swamp. And still the bells ring. Those who live in the region, the few who remain in the scattered communities that dot the wetlands, know better than to go into the deep swamp. They teach their children to avoid certain areas, to turn back if they hear bells ringing where no bells should be. They speak in whispers of Bethel Hollow, though most of them could not tell you exactly what happened there or even if it was a real place. It has passed into local legend, a cautionary tale, a story told to keep people from venturing too far into the wild places. But sometimes, on still nights when the wind is calm and the swamp is quiet, you can hear them. 3 bells, ringing in harmony, calling out across the water. The sound carries for miles, clear and pure and terrible. Some say it is a warning, others say it is an invitation. A few, those who have heard it and felt its pull, say it is both. They say it is the sound of something that waits beneath the black water, patient and eternal, gathering souls into its choir. They say that everyone who hears it feels the urge to follow the sound to its source, to walk into the swamp and down into the water and keep going down, down into the earth, down to where the singers wait. They say that Bethel Hollow Church is still there, beneath the surface, its pews still arranged in neat rows, its altar still standing though tilted at an impossible angle. They say if you were to dive deep enough to descend into the cold darkness where light does not reach, you would find the bell tower standing upright, water flowing through its empty windows, and the bells themselves hanging motionless in the current. And you would hear the singing, clear as if it were happening right beside you, the voices of everyone who was ever claimed by this place, everyone who heard the call and answered it, singing an eternal hymn to something that exists in the cracks between faith and terror, between the world of the living and the vast hungry darkness that waits beneath all things. The Chitimacha knew. They tried to keep it contained with their rituals, their offerings, their songs. The Spanish missionaries suspected, though they did not understand. Josiah Crane, in his arrogance, thought he could dominate it, sanctify it, make it serve his vision of righteousness. Ezekiel Ward learned too late that some things cannot be redeemed, cannot be saved, can only be avoided or endured. The church sank into the swamp in the summer of 1888, taking with it 60 souls who had nowhere else to go and no way to escape. But it never left. Not really. It is still there, still waiting, still calling. The bells ring on, defying physics and reason and all laws of the natural world. They ring in the night. They ring in storms. They ring on clear days when the air is still and the swamp is silent. They ring from beneath the water, from beneath the earth, from some place that exists outside of normal space and time. And if you listen closely, if you are ever in that nameless stretch of southern Louisiana where the cypress grows thick and the water runs dark and still, you might hear them too. You will know the sound when you hear it. Bronze bells, 3 of them, ringing in harmony, their tones clear and mournful and impossibly, terribly beautiful. You will feel the urge to follow the sound, to find its source, to understand what it means and where it comes from. Do not follow it. Do not seek it out. Do not answer the call, because some frontiers were never meant to be crossed, and some churches were built on ground that should have remained forever unhallowed. The bells of Bethel Hollow still ring, and they will go on ringing, calling out across the water, calling down into the earth, calling forward through time, gathering voices for a choir that will never be silenced, singing a song that began before history and will continue long after the last human voice has fallen silent. The Ward family was never found, though search parties looked for them when concerned relatives in Baton Rouge received no response to their letters. The official record states that Ezekiel Ward, his wife Martha, and their daughter Sarah perished in the flooding that devastated that region in the summer of 1888. Their bodies presumably swept away by the current and lost to the swamp. Their names are inscribed on a memorial in a Baton Rouge cemetery, though no bodies lie beneath the stone. But the journal survived, pulled from the wreckage of the parsonage by a salvage crew, and eventually finding its way to the archives where it lay forgotten for nearly a century. And in its pages, in Ezekiel Ward's increasingly desperate handwriting, is preserved the truth of what happened in Bethel Hollow, a truth that no one believed when the journal was finally read and that most dismissed as the ravings of a man driven mad by isolation and fever. But those who have heard the bells know differently. They know that Ezekiel Ward was telling the truth, every word of it. They know because they have felt the pull themselves, the desire to follow the sound to its source, to join the choir that sings beneath the earth. They know because in their own dreams, they have walked through the submerged church, have seen the singers standing in their eternal congregation, have heard the hymn that has no beginning and no end. There are documentaries now about haunted Louisiana, paranormal investigation teams with night vision cameras and electromagnetic field detectors. Some of them have ventured into the deep swamp, searching for evidence of the supernatural, looking for Bethel Hollow. Most find nothing but mosquitoes and mud, but a very few, have reported anomalies, recording equipment that malfunctions in specific locations, compass needles that spin wildly, and sounds, always sounds, picked up on their sensitive microphones, sounds that might be wind through the trees or water moving through submerged structures, or might be something else entirely, something that sounds almost like singing, something that sounds almost like bells. One such team, in 2012, claimed to have found the site. They had used ground-penetrating radar and sonar equipment to map the swamp floor, and they had discovered what appeared to be a large structure submerged in what they measured as 140 feet of water, in a sinkhole that seemed to have no bottom. They obtained permits to dive, and 3 members of the team descended into the darkness with underwater cameras and lights. The footage they brought back is grainy and unclear, compromised by the sediment in the water and the limitations of their equipment. But you can see shapes, regular and angular, in a way that natural formations are not. You can see what might be walls, what might be windows. And in one brief sequence, before the camera abruptly cuts to black, you can see something that looks unmistakably like a bell, green with age, hanging in the dark water, surrounded by shapes that might be fish or might be something else, something that moves with too much purpose to be merely animal. The divers reported that they heard sounds underwater, a humming or vibration that seemed to come from the structure itself. One of them, a woman named Jennifer Chen, said that she felt an overwhelming urge to remove her regulator and breathe in the water, to let it fill her lungs and pull her down deeper. She resisted, but the feeling was so strong that her companions had to physically drag her back to the surface. She refused to speak about the experience afterward, except to say that she had heard singing, clear and beautiful, and that part of her wanted to go back, wanted to descend again, and keep descending until she reached the bottom of whatever abyss held that structure. The team's findings were published online and promptly dismissed by skeptics as either hoax or misidentification of natural features. The video was analyzed and found to be unaltered, but experts said it was impossible to determine what the divers had actually seen. It could be an old structure of some kind, they admitted, but proving it was a church from the 1800s would require more extensive investigation, and no one was willing to fund such a project. Jennifer Chen died 2 years later, drowning in her bathtub in what was ruled an accidental death. The other divers went on with their lives, but they never returned to that stretch of Louisiana swamp, and they never spoke publicly about what they had experienced there. The bells ring on. They always do. They always will. In the deep places of the earth where the water is cold and black and no light penetrates, Bethel Hollow Church stands eternal, its congregation still assembled, still singing, still waiting for the next soul to hear the call and answer it. The thing that waits beneath, the thing that was there before the Chitimacha and will be there long after humanity is forgotten, continues its patient harvest, gathering voices, one by one, adding them to the choir that sings in the darkness beneath the world. Some say that on certain nights, when conditions are right, and the boundary between what is and what was becomes thin and permeable, you can see lights moving through the swamp, corpse lights dancing over the water, leading deeper and deeper into the wild places. Some say these are the spirits of those who were taken, trying to lure others to join them. Others say they are warnings, attempts by trapped souls to prevent others from suffering their fate. But the lights are rare, and the warnings, if that is what they are, go unheeded by those few foolish or desperate or curious enough to venture into the deep swamp in search of answers. And the bells keep ringing, their sound carrying across the water, across the years, across the thin membrane that separates our world from whatever realm lies beneath and beyond it. They ring for those who can hear them. They ring for those who will come. They ring for those who are already walking toward the water, drawn by a sound that bypasses reason and speaks directly to something ancient in the human soul, something that remembers when we lived closer to the darkness and knew to fear the things that moved within it. Bethel Hollow is gone, swallowed by the swamp, erased from maps and memory, but it is not forgotten, not by the land itself, not by the water that covers it, not by the thing that claims it as its domain. It waits there still, patient and eternal, and it will be waiting long after the last human being has drawn their final breath, after our cities have crumbled to dust and our civilization is less than a legend. The church will stand in its flooded sanctuary, and the bells will ring, and the singers will sing their endless hymn, because some hungers are older than time and some prayers are never answered because they were never meant to be. This is the story of Bethel Hollow Church, and the bells that rang from the swamp long after it sank. This is the story of Ezekiel Ward and his family, of Josiah Crane and Tobias, and all the nameless souls who were claimed by something that has no name, in any language spoken above ground. This is the story of a frontier that should never have been crossed, a boundary that should never have been tested, a place where human ambition and divine absence created a void that something else was all too willing to fill. The story is true, as much as any story can be true when dealing with things that exist in the spaces between truth and nightmare. The journal exists, though access to it is restricted, and most scholars dismiss it as an interesting example of 19th century psychological breakdown under frontier conditions. The site exists, though it is marked on no map and guarded by nothing but swamp and distance and the reluctance of locals to speak of it. The bells exist, though whether they exist in the physical world or in some other place that occasionally intersects with ours is a question that cannot be answered with any certainty. What is certain is this: if you ever find yourself in the deep swamp of southern Louisiana, in that nameless region where the water is dark and still and the cypress trees grow so close together that the sun is a memory rather than a presence, and if you hear bells ringing, clear and mournful and beautiful beyond words, turn back. Turn back immediately. Do not investigate. Do not seek the source. Do not listen to the voice in your head that says you should just go a little further. Just see what is making that sound. Just understand what it means, because the bells of Bethel Hollow still ring, and they are ringing for you. They are always ringing for someone. They will never stop ringing, not until every soul that can hear them has answered the call, has joined the choir, has descended into the black water and down into the earth to take their place among the singers who stand in the flooded church and sing their eternal song to something that was old when the world was young and will be singing long after the world is gone. Some frontiers were never meant to be crossed. Some churches were built on ground that hunger for flesh and soul and the essence of human despair. Some bells once rung can never be silenced, and some songs once begun can never end, can only grow louder and more insistent as more voices join the chorus, singing in languages living and dead and never spoken, singing words that bypass meaning and go straight to the primitive centers of the brain, where terror and awe are indistinguishable from each other. The bells ring on. They are ringing now. They are always ringing. And if you listen, if you really listen, you can hear them, faint and far away, calling across the distance, calling across time, calling to something deep inside you that wants to answer, that has always wanted to answer, that knows that eventually, inevitably, everyone answers the call. Everyone joins the choir. Everyone sinks down into the darkness where the water is warm, and the singing is beautiful, and the bells ring forever in the flooded church beneath the swamp. This is the cursed frontier, where the American dream drowned in black water, and something else rose in its place. Something that wears the shape of salvation but offers only endless service in a congregation that has no Sunday, no rest, no mercy, and no end. The Ward family learned this truth. Josiah Crane learned it before them. The Chitimacha knew it all along, and now you know it too. Remember, when you hear the bells, when that sound touches something in your chest and makes your heart beat in time with those deep bronze tones, remember what happened to those who answered before you. Remember Bethel Hollow. Remember the church that sank. Remember the choir that sings beneath the earth. And then, if you are wise, if you value your soul and your sanity and your place among the living, you will walk away, will turn your back on the sound no matter how much it pulls at you, will go back to the world of light and air and dry ground, and you will never speak of what you heard. You will try to forget, though you never truly will, because the sound of those bells, once heard, is branded into memory like a scar burned into flesh. Some stories have no happy ending. Some mysteries have no solution that human minds can comprehend. Some places exist at the intersection of geography and nightmare, where the map of the world and the map of hell overlap. And in those places, the rules we think govern reality cease to apply. Bethel Hollow is such a place, was such a place, will always be such a place, existing simultaneously in the past and the present and the future, a wound in the skin of the world that never heals, that continually seeps darkness and despair, and the sound of bells ringing in the swamp. The church sank in 1888, but it is sinking still, will always be sinking, frozen in the moment of its descent into the hungry earth, a monument to the terrible truth that some frontiers should remain uncrossed, and some ground should remain forever unhallowed. The bells rang then. They ring now. They will ring tomorrow and 1,000 years from tomorrow, calling out across the water, across time, across the borders between life and death and whatever lies beyond both. This is the testimony. This is the warning. This is the story that had to be told even though no one wants to hear it, even though belief in it opens doors in the mind that are better left closed. The bells of Bethel Hollow still ring from the swamp, long after the church sank, and they will go on ringing until the last star dies and the universe falls silent at last. And even then, in that final darkness, if anything remains to hear, the bells will still be ringing. Because some songs can never end, some choirs can never be disbanded, and some curses, once laid upon the land, can never be lifted, can only grow stronger with each passing year, each soul claimed, each voice added to the endless hymn. Listen, can you hear them? The bells are ringing. They are always ringing, and they are ringing for you.